I never thought I'd find myself in this position, married with a beautiful daughter and another child on the way. Growing up in a small town, I had always dreamed of a better life, one where I could make a difference and provide for my family in ways my parents never could. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. My husband, Ethan, and I had been happily married for 5 years. He was a successful software engineer, and I was a dedicated nurse. Our daughter, Lily, was the light of our lives. She had just turned 4 and was the spitting image of her father, with his warm brown eyes and infectious smile. Everything seemed perfect until the day we received the devastating news that Ethan's father had passed away suddenly. He had been a kind and supportive figure in my life, always treating me like a daughter. His loss left a gaping hole in our family, as we struggled to come to terms with our grief. Ethan's mother, Mona, suggested moving in with us to help with the household and my second pregnancy. At first I was hesitant. Mona and I had never seen eye to eye, but Ethan convinced me that having her around would be beneficial, especially with his frequent work trips. Little did I know that her presence would turn my life upside down. From the moment she moved in, Mona made it clear that she was in charge. She criticized my every move, from the way I cooked to how I raised Lily. "You're too soft on her," she would say, her voice dripping with condescension. "She needs discipline, or she'll end up just like you." I tried my best to brush off her comments, focusing on my work and taking care of Lily. But as my pregnancy progressed, I found myself increasingly exhausted and overwhelmed. Ethan was rarely home, and when he was too preoccupied with work to notice the tension between his mother and me. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift at the hospital, I found Mona rearranging the nursery I had spent weeks preparing. "This won't do," she declared, holding up the soft yellow blanket I had lovingly chosen. "The baby needs something more practical, not these frivolous things." I felt my anger rising, but I swallowed my words, not wanting to cause a scene. Instead, I retreated to my room, fighting back tears of frustration and helplessness. As the weeks wore on, Mona's behavior became increasingly intolerable. She would disappear for hours, leaving me to handle all the housework and childcare, only to return with a list of complaints about how I was failing as a wife and mother. I knew I needed to talk to Ethan, to make him understand how much his mother's presence was affecting me. But every time I tried, he would dismiss my concerns, saying that I was overreacting and that his mother meant well. I felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of Mona's constant criticism and Ethan's inability to see the truth. I longed for an escape, for someone to understand what I was going through. Little did I know that my breaking point was just around the corner, and it would come in the form of a life-threatening illness that would test the limits of my strength and the bonds of my family. As Mona settled into our home, I quickly realized that her offer to help was nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to control every aspect of our lives. She took over the kitchen, insisting on cooking meals that catered to her tastes, disregarding the fact that I was struggling with morning sickness and food aversions. "Jade, you need to eat more," she would chide, pushing a plate of greasy bacon and eggs towards me. "You're eating for 2 now, and my grandchild needs proper nourishment." I would force myself to take a few bites, fighting the urge to gag, knowing that any protest would only lead to a lecture about my inadequacies as a mother. Mona's presence also put a strain on my relationship with Ethan. She would monopolize his time, insisting on long conversations about his work and his plans for the future, leaving little room for me to connect with my husband. One evening, as I was putting Lily to bed, I overheard Mona talking to Ethan in the living room. "You know, Ethan, you really should consider taking that promotion in New York. It's a fantastic opportunity, and you can't let Jade hold you back." I felt my heart sink as I listened to Ethan's response. "I know, Mom, but it's not that simple. Jade's job is here, and with the baby coming, I don't think it's the right time." "Nonsense," Mona scoffed. "Jade can find work anywhere, and I'll be here to help with the children. You need to think about your career, Ethan. Don't let her selfish desires ruin your chances of success." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could Mona be so dismissive of my needs and desires? And why wasn't Ethan standing up for me? As the days turned into weeks, I found myself growing more and more resentful of Mona's presence in our home. She would criticize the way I dressed, the way I spoke, even the way I breathed. Nothing I did was ever good enough for her. "Really, Jade, you should take better care of yourself," she would say, eyeing my swollen ankles and exhausted face. "No wonder Ethan is always working late. Who would want to come home to this?" Her words cut deep, but I refused to let her see how much she was getting to me. I threw myself into my work, taking on extra shifts at the hospital, desperate for a reprieve from the constant criticism and belittlement. But even at work, I couldn't escape Mona's influence. She would call me constantly, demanding updates on my whereabouts and when I would be home. If I didn't answer right away, she would leave scathing voicemails, accusing me of neglecting my family. I knew I needed help, but I didn't know where to turn. My friends were all busy with their own lives, and I didn't want to burden them with my problems. I felt utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. One afternoon, as I was leaving the hospital after a particularly grueling shift, I ran into my neighbor, Zoe. She took one look at my tear-stained face and pulled me into a tight hug. "Oh, honey, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I broke down, pouring out all the frustrations and pain I had been holding in for so long. Zoe listened patiently, offering words of comfort and support. "You can't let her treat you like this, Jade," she said firmly. "You need to stand up for yourself, for your family. Ethan needs to know what's going on, and you need to set some boundaries with Mona." I knew Zoe was right, but the thought of confronting Mona filled me with dread. She had already proven herself to be a master manipulator, and I feared that any attempt to stand up to her would only make things worse. Little did I know that my fears were about to become a reality, and that the price of my silence would be higher than I ever could have imagined. Zoe's words echoed in my mind as I drove home from the hospital, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I knew I needed to talk to Ethan, to make him understand the hell I had been living in since Mona moved in, but the thought of facing his mother's wrath made my stomach churn. As I pulled into the driveway, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation that was sure to come. I walked into the house, expecting to find Mona waiting for me with her usual barrage of insults and criticisms, but instead, I was greeted by an eerie silence. I made my way to the living room, where I found Ethan sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He looked up as I entered, his eyes red and puffy from crying. "Ethan, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice filled with concern. "It's Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "She's gone." For a moment I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Mona had finally realized the error of her ways and decided to leave on her own. But as I looked closer at Ethan's face, I realized that something was terribly wrong. "What do you mean she's gone?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "She left a note," Ethan said, handing me a piece of paper. "She said she can't stand to be around us anymore, that we're ungrateful and selfish, and that she's going to stay with her friends until we come to our senses." I read the note, my eyes widening with each word. Mona had painted herself as the victim, claiming that I had driven her away with my constant demands and lack of appreciation for all she had done for us. "This is ridiculous," I said, crumpling the note in my fist. "She's the one who's been making our lives miserable, not the other way around." Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with confusion and hurt. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Jade. Mom has always been there for me, and now she's saying all these terrible things about you. I just don't know what to do." I felt my anger rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Ethan, you have to trust me. Your mother has been manipulating you, manipulating all of us. She's not the victim here. We are." But even as I spoke the words, I could see the doubt in Ethan's eyes. Mona had always been his rock, his constant support, and the thought of her being anything less than perfect was almost too much for him to bear. Over the next few days, I tried my best to carry on as normal, but the weight of Mona's absence hung heavy in the air. Ethan was distant, spending long hours at work and barely speaking to me when he was home. Lily, too, seemed to sense that something was wrong, clinging to me more than usual and asking constantly when Grandma would be coming back. I knew I needed to do something, to find a way to make Ethan see the truth about his mother, but I was at a loss. Every time I tried to bring up the subject, he would shut down, retreating into himself and leaving me feeling more alone than ever. It was during one of these moments of despair that I finally broke down, collapsing onto the bed in a fit of tears. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating under the weight of Mona's manipulation and Ethan's inability to see the truth. As I lay there, my body racked with sobs, I heard a soft knock on the door. I looked up to see Zoe standing there, her face filled with concern. "Oh, Jade," she said, rushing to my side and pulling me into a hug. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea things had gotten this bad." I clung to her, pouring out all the pain and frustration I had been holding in for so long. Zoe listened patiently, offering words of comfort and support. "You can't let her win, Jade," she said firmly. "You have to keep fighting, for yourself and for your family. Ethan will come around eventually, but you have to be strong until then." I knew Zoe was right, but I also knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. Mona had already proven herself to be a formidable opponent, and I feared that the price of standing up to her would be higher than I ever could have imagined. As the weeks passed, I threw myself into my work, taking on extra shifts at the hospital in a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating atmosphere at home. Ethan was rarely around, his business trips becoming more frequent and longer in duration. I knew he was using work as an excuse to avoid dealing with the tension between his mother and me, but I couldn't bring myself to confront him about it. One evening, as I was preparing dinner for Lily and myself, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to the stress and exhaustion of the past few months, but as the night wore on, the pain only intensified. By the time I put Lily to bed, I was struggling to breathe, my vision blurring at the edges. I knew I needed help, but Ethan was out of town, and I couldn't bear the thought of calling Mona. In a moment of desperation, I reached for my phone and dialed Zoe's number. "Jade, what's wrong?" she answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Zoe, I need help," I gasped, my words coming out in short, painful bursts. "I think there's something wrong with the baby." Zoe was at my door in minutes, her face pale with worry. She took one look at me and immediately called for an ambulance. As we waited for the paramedics to arrive, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. I knew that my condition was serious, and I feared for the life of my unborn child. When the ambulance finally arrived, I was barely conscious, my body racked with pain and fever. The paramedics worked quickly, loading me onto a stretcher and rushing me to the hospital. As I lay in the emergency room, hooked up to a myriad of machines and monitors, I overheard the doctors discussing my condition. "Pneumonia," they said, their voices grave. "And she's 7 months pregnant. We need to act fast." I felt a surge of panic wash over me. Pneumonia was serious enough on its own, but coupled with my pregnancy, it could be deadly. As the doctors worked to stabilize my condition, I drifted in and out of consciousness, my mind filled with thoughts of Lily and my unborn child. I knew I needed to fight, to be strong for them, but I could feel my body weakening with each passing minute. It was during one of these moments of lucidity that I remembered Mona. Despite everything she had put me through, I knew that she needed to be informed of my condition. I asked Zoe to contact her, hoping that she would put aside her animosity and be there for her son and grandchildren. But as the hours passed and Mona failed to appear, I began to realize the depths of her cruelty. Even in my darkest hour, she couldn't be bothered to show an ounce of compassion or concern. Ethan, on the other hand, rushed to my side as soon as he received word of my condition. He sat by my bedside, holding my hand and whispering words of encouragement, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Jade," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have been here for you, for our family. I promise things will be different from now on." I wanted to believe him, to take comfort in his words, but I knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. Mona's influence had taken root, and it would take more than a few apologies to undo the damage she had caused. As I lay there, fighting for my life and the life of my unborn child, I couldn't help but wonder how things had gotten so bad. How had I allowed myself to become so isolated, so alone in my struggles? And how could I ever hope to rebuild my family in the face of such overwhelming adversity? But even in my darkest moments, I knew that I had to keep fighting, for Lily, for my unborn child, and for the life I knew we deserved. No matter what it took, I would find a way to break free from Mona's grip and reclaim the happiness that had been stolen from us. As I fought for my life in the hospital, Zoe remained by my side, a constant source of support and comfort. She sat with me for hours, holding my hand and wiping the sweat from my brow, her eyes filled with concern and compassion. "You're going to get through this, Jade," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "You're one of the strongest people I know, and you have so much to live for." I wanted to believe her, to take strength from her words, but the pain and exhaustion were overwhelming. I could feel my body weakening with each passing hour, and I feared that I might not have the strength to keep fighting. It was during one of these moments of despair that Ethan finally returned to the hospital, his face drawn and haggard. He had been away on business when I first fell ill, and it had taken him nearly 2 days to make it back to the city. "Jade, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking as he took my hand in his. "I should have been here sooner. I never should have left you alone with my mother." I could see the guilt and regret in his eyes, and I knew that he was finally beginning to understand the toll that Mona's behavior had taken on our family. "It's not your fault, Ethan," I said, my voice weak and raspy. "You couldn't have known how bad things would get." But even as I spoke the words, I knew that they weren't entirely true. Ethan had seen the way his mother treated me, had heard the cruel words she spoke and the manipulative games she played. He had chosen to ignore it, to bury his head in the sand and hope that things would get better on their own. And now, as I lay in the hospital bed, fighting for my life and the life of our unborn child, the consequences of that choice had become all too clear. Over the next few days, my condition began to improve, thanks in no small part to the tireless efforts of the hospital staff. They worked around the clock to monitor my vital signs and adjust my medications, doing everything in their power to ensure that both the baby and I remained stable. Ethan rarely left my side during this time. His attention focused solely on my well-being and the well-being of our child. He slept in a chair by my bed, holding my hand and whispering words of love and encouragement, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. "I promise, Jade, things will be different from now on," he said, his voice firm with resolve. "I won't let my mother hurt you or our family ever again." I wanted to believe him, to take comfort in his words, but a part of me couldn't help but wonder if it was too little, too late. Mona's influence had taken root, and it would take more than a few promises to undo the damage she had caused. As the days turned into weeks, I slowly began to regain my strength, my body healing from the ravages of the pneumonia. The baby, too, seemed to be thriving, growing stronger with each passing day. But even as my physical health improved, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Mona's absence weighed heavily on my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder what she was planning, what new scheme she might be hatching to tear our family apart. It was during one of these moments of anxiety that Zoe came to visit, her face filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "Jade, there's something you need to know," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I overheard Mona talking to one of her friends on the phone. She's planning to leave for a luxury cruise tomorrow, and she doesn't intend to come back until after the baby is born." I felt a surge of anger wash over me, hot and fierce. How could Mona be so selfish, so cruel? How could she abandon her own grandchild in their hour of need? But even as the anger burned within me, I knew that I couldn't let it consume me. I had to stay focused on my own recovery, on the health and well-being of my unborn child. And so, with a heavy heart and a newfound sense of determination, I began to plan for the future, a future without Mona and her toxic influence. I knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but I also knew that I had the strength and the support to see it through. No matter what challenges lay ahead, I would fight for my family, for the life we deserved. And I would do it with the love and support of those who truly cared for me, those who would stand by my side through thick and thin. Mona lounged on the deck of the luxury cruise ship, sipping a cocktail and basking in the warm sun. She had been looking forward to this trip for months, a chance to escape the drama and responsibilities of family life and indulge in some much-needed relaxation. As she lay there, her mind drifted to thoughts of Jade and the baby. She knew that her daughter-in-law was still in the hospital, fighting for her life, but she couldn't bring herself to feel any real concern. In her mind, Jade had brought this on herself, with her constant demands and selfish behavior. Suddenly, Mona's phone buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen, expecting to see a text from one of her friends, but instead, she saw a voicemail from Lily. Curious, she pressed play and held the phone to her ear. At first, she couldn't make out what her granddaughter was saying, her voice muffled and distant. But as she listened more closely, she felt a chill run down her spine. "Grandma, please come home," Lily pleaded, her voice thick with tears. "Mommy is really sick, and the doctors say she might not make it. We need you here, Grandma. Please come back." Mona felt a surge of panic wash over her. She had never heard Lily sound so frightened, so desperate, and the thought of Jade actually dying, of leaving her grandchildren without a mother, was almost too much to bear. Without a second thought, Mona grabbed her bags and rushed off the ship, her mind racing with possibilities. She knew that she needed to get to the hospital as quickly as possible, to be there for her son and grandchildren in their hour of need. As she raced through the airport, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Mona couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. She had always known that her behavior towards Jade was wrong, that her constant criticism and manipulation were taking a toll on their family. But she had never imagined that it would come to this, that her own selfishness could put the life of her unborn grandchild at risk. When she finally arrived at the hospital, Mona was met with a sight that made her blood run cold. Ethan was standing outside Jade's room, his face twisted with rage and disgust. "How dare you show your face here?" he spat, his voice shaking with anger. "After everything you've done, after all the pain you've caused, you have the nerve to come crawling back now?" Mona opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She could see the hurt and betrayal in her son's eyes, and she knew that there was nothing she could say to make it right. "Jade is fighting for her life in there," Ethan continued, his voice rising with each word. "She's been through hell, and it's all because of you. Your constant criticism, your manipulative games, your selfish behavior. You've torn this family apart, and now you have the audacity to show up here and play the concerned grandmother?" Mona felt tears streaming down her face, hot and shameful. She knew that Ethan was right, that she had no one to blame but herself for the state of their family. "Ethan, please," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I've made mistakes, and I'm so sorry for all the pain I've caused. But please let me see Jade. Let me be there for her, for all of you." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his eyes hard and unforgiving. Finally, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter the room. As Mona approached Jade's bedside, she felt a wave of guilt and shame wash over her. Her daughter-in-law lay there, pale and still, her body hooked up to a myriad of machines and monitors. "Jade, I'm so sorry," Mona whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I never meant for things to get this bad. I never meant to hurt you or our family." But even as she spoke the words, Mona knew that they were too little, too late. The damage had been done, and it would take more than a few apologies to make things right. As she sat there holding Jade's hand and praying for a miracle, Mona knew that she had a long road ahead of her, a road of redemption, of making amends for all the pain and suffering she had caused. And she knew that it would be a difficult journey, one that would test her in ways she had never been tested before. But for the sake of her family, for the sake of the precious life growing inside Jade, she knew that she had to try. As I lay in the hospital bed, fighting through the haze of pain and medication, I could hear the sound of raised voices coming from the hallway. At first, I couldn't make out what they were saying, but as the voices grew louder and more agitated, I realized that it was Ethan and Mona. "How could you be so selfish, so cruel?" Ethan shouted, his voice shaking with anger. "Jade is lying in there, fighting for her life, and you couldn't even be bothered to show up until now?" "Ethan, please," Mona pleaded, her voice trembling. "I didn't know how serious it was. I thought—" "You thought what?" Ethan interrupted, his voice dripping with disgust. "That you could just abandon your family, go off on some luxury cruise, and everything would be fine? That Jade would just magically get better, and you could come back and play the doting grandmother? I could hear the shame and regret in Mona's voice as she tried to explain herself, but Ethan wasn't having it. He had seen the toll that her behavior had taken on our family, the pain and suffering that she had caused, and he wasn't about to let her off the hook. "You know, I used to look up to you," Ethan said, his voice growing quieter but no less intense. "I used to think that you were the strongest, most capable person I knew. But now I see you for what you really are. A selfish, manipulative woman who cares more about her own pleasure than the well-being of her own family." Mona started to protest, but Ethan cut her off. "No, I don't want to hear it. You've had your chance, and you blew it. You've caused nothing but pain and heartache for Jade, for our children, and for me, and I won't stand for it anymore." I could hear the sound of footsteps, and then the door to my room opened. Ethan walked in, his face drawn and haggard, but his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "Jade, I'm so sorry," he said, taking my hand in his. "I'm sorry for not standing up to my mother sooner, for not protecting you the way I should have, but I promise things will be different from now on." I nodded, too weak to speak, but I could feel the love and support radiating from him. He had finally seen the truth about his mother, had finally understood the depths of her cruelty and manipulation, and he was ready to make a change. Over the next few days, as I slowly regained my strength, Ethan rarely left my side. He sat with me for hours, holding my hand and talking about our future, about the life we would build together without Mona's toxic influence. And when the time came for me to give birth, he was right there beside me, coaching me through every contraction and cheering me on as I brought our beautiful baby boy into the world. As I held my son in my arms, I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope and renewal wash over me. We had been through so much, had faced such incredible adversity, but we had come out the other side stronger and more united than ever before. And as I looked into Ethan's eyes, I knew that we would face whatever challenges lay ahead together, as a family. We had each other, and we had the love and support of those who truly cared for us, and that was all we needed to build the life we deserved. In the days and weeks that followed, I learned that Mona's friends, horrified by her behavior, had cut all ties with her. She was left alone and isolated, forced to confront the consequences of her actions and the pain she had caused. But for us, life went on. We moved forward, focusing on our family and the love we shared. And though the scars of the past would always be with us, we knew that we had the strength and resilience to overcome anything that came our way. As I watched Ethan play with our children, his face filled with joy and laughter, I knew that we had finally found the happiness and peace that we had always deserved. And I knew that, no matter what the future held, we would face it together, united in our love and our commitment to each other. As the weeks turned into months, I slowly began to heal, both physically and emotionally. The birth of our son had brought a newfound sense of joy and purpose to our lives, and Ethan and I were determined to cherish every moment we had together as a family. But even as we celebrated this new chapter in our lives, the specter of Mona's betrayal still loomed large. I couldn't shake the feeling of anger and resentment that had taken root in my heart, the sense that she had gotten away with her cruelty and manipulation for far too long. It was during one of my follow-up appointments with the doctor that I finally learned the true extent of Mona's isolation. As I sat in the waiting room, flipping through a magazine, I overheard two of the nurses talking about her. "Did you hear about that awful woman who abandoned her daughter-in-law when she was in the hospital?" one of them said, her voice dripping with disgust. "Yeah, I heard she went on some fancy cruise instead of being there for her family," the other replied. "What kind of monster does that?" I felt a surge of vindication wash over me. It seemed that Mona's actions had finally caught up with her, that the people in her life were starting to see her for who she really was. Later that day, as I was putting away some of the baby's clothes, I found a letter tucked away in the back of the drawer. It was from Mona, written in her familiar spidery handwriting. "Jade," the letter began, "I know that I have caused you and our family a great deal of pain, and for that I am truly sorry. I have spent the last few months reflecting on my actions, and I have come to realize the depths of my selfishness and cruelty." I felt my heart start to race as I read on, my eyes scanning the page for any hint of sincerity or remorse. I know that I can never make up for the harm I have caused, but I want you to know that I am committed to being a better person, a better mother, and a better grandmother. I hope that someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me." I stared at the letter for a long moment, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. A part of me wanted to believe her, to think that she had truly changed and was ready to make amends. But another part of me, the part that had endured years of her manipulation and abuse, knew better. I had seen firsthand the depths of her cruelty, the way she had torn our family apart with her selfish behavior. And so, with a heavy heart, I tore the letter into pieces, watching as the fragments fluttered to the ground like confetti. I knew that I could never forgive Mona, could never let her back into our lives after all the pain she had caused. But I also knew that I couldn't let her betrayal define me, couldn't let it poison the love and happiness that Ethan and I had worked so hard to build. And so, I made a choice to focus on the future, on the life we had created together. A choice to surround myself with people who truly cared for me, who would stand by my side through thick and thin. In the years that followed, Ethan and I watched our children grow and thrive, our love for each other deepening with each passing day. We faced our challenges head-on, united in our commitment to each other and our family. And though the scars of the past would always be with us, we knew that we had the strength and resilience to overcome anything that came our way. As I watched Lily and our son play together in the backyard, their laughter ringing out like music, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. We had weathered the storm, had emerged from the darkness stronger and more united than ever before. And I knew that, no matter what the future held, we would face it together, bound by the unbreakable bonds of love and family. Mona's betrayal had taught me the true price of selfishness and cruelty, but it had also shown me the incredible power of forgiveness and hope. And that, I knew, was a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life.